Would you risk your life to save a dog you've never met? What if that dog was clinging to a cliff edge and no one else was coming? What if that rescue led you to a man clinging to life and a second chance at the redemption you thought you'd lost forever? How far would you go if this was your one shot to make things right? The late afternoon sun fell gently over Springdale, Utah, warming the red cliffs of Zion National Park with a soft golden hue. The wind had picked up, dry and restless, scattering sand through the canyons and rustling the sparse brush lining the trail that cut past the edge of town and into the wilderness. Frank Delaney walked with his hands deep in his pockets, his steps heavy, his breath misting faintly in the crisp autumn air. He was a tall man, though slightly stooped with age, 60 years old and worn in every sense. His face, tanned and lined like the sandstone ridges above him, carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who hadn't felt useful in a long time. His dark gray hair, once thick, now curled loosely at his neck beneath a faded baseball cap, and his eyes, a stormy blue, betrayed a lifetime of regret. He wore a battered utility jacket, work jeans stained from years past, and old hiking boots he hadn't used seriously since he was laid off from his construction job 2 years ago. The job had been the last thread of structure after his wife passed. Since then, the house had grown silent, save for the creaks of wind against the window frames. His son, Evan, hadn't returned his calls in months. And Marley, the golden-furred dog he'd once cherished like a child, was long gone, killed in an accident that haunted Frank's dreams with unbearable clarity. He'd woken that morning soaked in sweat, remembering Marley's whimper trapped under the garage beam, the helplessness of watching a life fade under his hands. Today, Frank had set out with no real purpose except to gather some fallen branches to burn for the night. Gas prices were too high to justify heating. The trail led him near the Whispering Stones Canyon, a lesser-known split in the rock face where the wind often played tricks on the ears. Locals said it whispered voices. Frank had heard it before. Once or twice he imagined his wife's laugh on the breeze. But today, it wasn't a whisper. It was sharp. Desperate, a bark. He froze. The sound echoed again, higher this time, a single bark, long and ragged, followed by silence. Then another. Not a coyote, not the sharp yip of a fox or the high screech of birds. It was the unmistakable cry of a dog. He scanned the canyon ridge, stepping closer to the edge of the gorge, which dipped nearly 100 feet into a shadowed ravine between the stone walls. The dog barked again. This time, closer. Somewhere near a sheer cliff edge to the right. Frank walked cautiously, gravel shifting under his boots. His heart had begun to pound in that old, sickening rhythm, one he recognized from years of emergency calls on job sites, from the final seconds before Marley had stopped breathing. He didn't want to see what he feared he would. He reached the ledge. Down below, on a protruding stone shelf barely wider than a sidewalk curb, stood a dog, a golden retriever. Its coat, though dulled and dusty, still shone with hints of honeyed gold where the light struck. The dog was standing stiff, its tail low, body pressed to the stone behind it. It barked again, not out of aggression, but out of fear and exhaustion. The wind stirred its fur and sent loose gravel tumbling from the ledge into the void below. Frank took an involuntary step back from the edge, his legs trembling. The dog was stranded. No trail. No outcrop near enough for it to jump. Just that ledge and a sheer drop below. How had it gotten there? He scanned the surroundings. The canyon wall above was jagged, possibly accessible by a narrow side route, but nothing easy. No collar was visible from this distance, but it didn't matter. The animal was in trouble, and no one else was here to see it. Frank knelt, resting his hand on a boulder for balance, staring at the dog. For a long moment, they looked at each other, man and animal, connected only by the wind between them and something unspoken. The dog's eyes were dark, wide, pleading, and in them, Frank saw something that shattered him. He saw Marley. Not the face exactly, but the same look of fear, of resignation. The ache in his chest flared. Not again, he muttered. His voice cracked from disuse. For a second, he hesitated. Should he go back? Try to call someone? But his flip phone had barely enough signal to check the weather. By the time help arrived, if it did, the dog could fall. The sun was sinking lower. The wind had picked up. He looked again. The retriever was now lying down on the ledge, curling slightly as if bracing for cold. A soft whimper floated up to him like smoke. Frank stood up slowly. His knees popped. His hands clenched and unclenched. He couldn't undo Marley's death. He couldn't bring back his wife. He couldn't fix the years of silence between him and Evan. But maybe he could save one life today, even if it cost him everything. "I'm coming," he said aloud, surprising even himself with the strength in his voice. The dog didn't move. It only blinked once, slowly, as if it somehow understood. Frank turned from the cliff edge, heading back up the trail. He would need rope, harness, gear, tools. He had an old climbing kit in his shed. Dusty, unused for decades, but still intact. Maybe. He'd have to check. There was no time to think of anything else. No time to plan much. He would climb down that damn cliff if he had to crawl. As he walked, the cold air nipped at his face. Somewhere behind him, a final bark echoed. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a plea. It was a thread. A lifeline, stretching from that ledge to the hollow inside him that had been empty for far too long. And Frank Delaney, for the first time in years, felt like a man who still had something left to give. The moon had begun its slow rise above the towering cliffs of Zion National Park, bathing the ridgelines in soft silver and shadow. Down in Springdale, most porch lights had already winked off for the night, but in the small house at the edge of town, Frank Delaney was busy moving like a man possessed. He hadn't acted with this much urgency in years, not since the accident, not since the layoff, not since Beth passed. His hands trembled as he dug through a dusty corner of the shed, brushing aside old paint cans and broken tools to reach the bundle he hadn't touched in over 2 decades. It was all still there. The climbing harness, stiff with age but intact. Ropes, coiled and dry, which he checked foot by foot for frays or rot. Carabiners, some rusted at the edges, others still sound. He laid them out on the workbench like surgical instruments, his breath fogging in the cold air. The gloves barely fit his knotted fingers, but he slipped them on anyway. When he caught his reflection in the shed window, bent shoulders, creased face, haunted eyes, it startled him. But tonight, he wasn't that man. Tonight, he had a mission. Before heading out, he made one more stop. Lana Cooper's cafe was still lit from within, though the sign had been flipped to closed. She stood behind the counter wiping down the espresso machine, her shoulders slightly slumped from a long shift. At 34, Lana carried herself with the resilience of someone who had weathered far too much too young. Her dark auburn hair was tied back in a messy bun, flour dusted her forearm, and she wore a faded t-shirt with a cracked sunflower logo above the heart. She lived alone with her 5-year-old daughter and rarely spoke about the girl's father. But anyone who had spent 5 minutes in Lana's presence knew she wasn't easily shaken. When Frank pushed open the door, she glanced up with quiet surprise. "Frank? Thought you'd be home by now." "Just passing through," he muttered, dropping a few bills on the counter. "Figured I could use something warm." She studied him. "You look like you're going camping. Or going to war." He didn't answer right away. She reached behind the counter and pulled a wrapped muffin from the warmer, placing it in a paper bag. "Blueberry. Last one," she said, nudging the bag toward him. "On the house." Frank hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Thanks." Lana leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You all right?" He met her eyes, deep brown and endlessly steady, and almost lied, but something in him resisted. "No, but maybe I will be, after tonight." Her mouth parted slightly, as if to speak, but then she just nodded. "Then go do what you need to do." Frank left without another word, bag in hand. The climb to the canyon rim took longer than he remembered. His knees weren't what they used to be, and the pack weighed heavier on his back than it should have. But when he finally reached the ridge overlooking Whispering Stones Canyon, the pain in his legs vanished, because the dog was still there. The same golden retriever, crouched low on the razor-thin ledge jutting from the cliff wall. The dog hadn't moved much, but his head was up now, ears alert. His golden coat shimmered faintly under the moonlight, streaked with dirt and blood. The animal looked up, and for a moment their eyes locked across the gap. There was something desperate, almost human, in that gaze. Frank knelt and secured the rope to a rock outcrop, tugging hard to test the anchor. The knot held. He pulled on the harness, checking each strap, adjusting the gloves one last time. "All right, old man," he muttered to himself. "Let's see if there's anything left in you." The rappel wasn't long, about 50 feet, but the terrain was brutal. The canyon wall was uneven, scattered with loose pebbles and broken chips of red stone that made each foothold a calculated risk. His gloves burned from the rope friction as he lowered himself inch by inch. Below him, the dog whimpered softly, shifting nervously on the ledge. Halfway down, the wind kicked up. It roared through the canyon like a freight train, slamming into Frank's back and making the rope sway. He braced his boots against the wall and waited, heart thundering. When it died down, he resumed the descent, reaching the final 10 feet above the ledge. From this vantage point, he saw how truly narrow the rock shelf was, barely wide enough for the dog to lie on, let alone turn around. One wrong movement could send them both plummeting into the darkness below. Frank adjusted his grip, exhaled slowly, and lowered himself the final stretch. His boots scraped against the stone as he eased onto the ledge, flattening himself against the cliff face. The dog tensed, ears flat, body rigid. Frank raised his voice, low and calm. "Easy, boy, I'm not going to hurt you." The retriever growled once, low and exhausted, but didn't move. Frank could see the whites of his eyes, the dirt crusting his snout, the slight tremor in his legs. "I'm here to help," Frank said again, inching forward. His movements were painfully slow, his body half pressed to the wall, one hand stretched outward. "I've got you, all right? Just don't move too quick." The dog sniffed the air, then, miraculously, leaned forward just enough to touch his nose to Frank's gloved hand. Frank felt his chest crack open at the gesture, that little sliver of trust. He didn't move yet, not until he was sure. He studied the dog, male, probably 5 or 6 years old, with a broad frame and tired eyes. His fur was matted in places, and there was a small cut along one leg, but he wasn't broken, just scared, just stranded. Frank reached into his pack slowly and pulled out a length of makeshift webbing, a sling he'd fashioned at home to use as an improvised dog harness. He laid it on the stone beside him. "We're gonna get you out of here," he whispered, "but we're gonna do it safe." Then a rock shifted under his boot. For one terrifying second, the entire ledge groaned and tilted. A chunk of stone broke loose and fell, clattering into the dark. The dog barked in terror and nearly lunged, but Frank caught him by the scruff, gripping the loose fur with both hands, bracing his own weight. "Easy, easy." The dog froze again, chest heaving. Frank's heart raced so hard it hurt his ribs. He stayed that way for a long minute, crouched against the cliff with the dog trembling against his arm. The stone beneath them crackled slightly, settling back into stillness. Frank shut his eyes. Beth's voice floated into his mind again, quiet, insistent. "Don't leave him." He pressed his forehead to the rock. "I'm not going to." But the rescue, that would have to wait for the next move. For now, all he could do was sit on that thin edge of the world and hold on to hope. The wind swept sharp and steady along the face of the cliff, carrying with it the dry scent of stone and the weight of silence. Frank Delaney pressed his back against the cold rock, his feet carefully balanced on a ledge not much wider than a loaf of bread. To his right, huddled on the very edge, the golden retriever lay curled with his paws tucked tightly beneath his chest, his ribs heaving in shallow breaths. The dog didn't move as Frank slowly crouched. Up close, the retriever looked worse than Frank had hoped, but better than he feared. He was large, probably around 5 years old, with a thick coat of golden fur that had been dulled to a dirty rust by days of dust, blood, and fear. One of his front paws was scraped raw. There was no collar. His ears barely flicked in the wind, and his eyes, when they turned to Frank, were wide and glossy. The kind of eyes Frank had seen too many times. On injured animals, on trapped men, on his own reflection some nights. Frank extended a gloved hand, palm open. "Hey there, buddy, you're all right." The dog sniffed once, too tired to react more. Frank scooted inch by inch along the wall, keeping his movements slow, non-threatening. The rope harness dug into his hip, anchored above. If he slipped now, he wouldn't fall far. But the dog had no such safety. One sudden lurch from either of them, and this ledge would no longer be enough. Frank exhaled through his nose. "You need a name," he said, more to calm himself than the dog. "Let's go with Rusty." "That fit you?" Rusty didn't answer, but he didn't flinch when Frank reached out to touch his side. The connection was faint but real. Frank had seen that look once before, years ago, on Marley, the dog he hadn't saved. Something between trust and surrender. A soul asking, "Will you try this time?" Frank pulled the harness from his pack with shaking fingers. The nylon webbing felt stiff from years of disuse, and his joints ached from the tension. The harness wasn't made for dogs, but he'd adjusted it back at the shed, hoping it might work. He eased the sling beneath Rusty's chest, wincing as the dog let out a small whimper of pain when he shifted his injured paw. "I know," Frank murmured, almost done. He clipped the harness to his own rope system, the knot caught with a dull click. Rusty was now attached to him. Any move they made, they'd make together. And then the mountain moved. A sudden cracking sound snapped through the air. The stone beneath Rusty's hind legs gave a brittle pop and fractured. A wedge of rock, about the size of a loaf of bread, broke free beneath the dog and dropped into the canyon below. Rusty yelped in panic. His body surged backward. Frank lunged without thinking. His shoulder screamed in protest as he caught the dog's scruff and pinned them both against the wall. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Gravel rattled down the face of the cliff. Dust filled the air. Frank's chest heaved. Rusty whimpered once and then went still. Frank didn't speak. He only breathed, slow, deep, steady. The rock had settled, but now they were more exposed, and the margin for error had disappeared. He turned his head and pressed his temple against the stone. The throbbing behind his eyes returned in a low pulse. He knew the signs. His head injury acting up again, a souvenir from a scaffold collapse a decade ago. When it flared, sometimes he heard Beth's voice, soft and ghost-like in his mind. It came now, faint and warm. "Don't leave him, Frank. Not this time." Frank gritted his teeth. "I won't," he whispered. "I swear to God, I won't." He looked down at Rusty, whose head now rested on his lap, body slack but still alert. The dog was done resisting. He had handed himself over, trusted Frank completely. That trust was more terrifying than the climb. Frank stayed still for several minutes, letting the dust settle, letting the cliff return to quiet. When the wind rose again, it was gentler, like breath instead of warning. He tested the rope between them, checked the harness again, made mental calculations. Distance, load, risk. The way down would be harder than up, but it was the only way now. He reached over and stroked Rusty's side once, calming both of them. Then, with quiet finality, Frank whispered, "We're going down together." But he didn't move yet. They weren't ready, not yet. The first few feet of descent were slower than Frank Delaney had anticipated. He had expected gravity and adrenaline to carry them down swiftly, but Rusty's weight shifted awkwardly against his side, and the rope creaked with strain. The old harness straps dug into Frank's ribs, and every movement had to be calculated, not just for his own safety, but for the trembling dog tethered to him like a second heartbeat. The canyon air was dry and sharp, each gust slicing between stone faces, stirring loose pebbles that clicked down into the unseen darkness below. About 10 feet into the rappel, the rope snagged. Not suddenly, not violently, but enough that Frank felt it in his core, a hesitation, a tension that shouldn't have been there. He froze midair, his boots braced against a slight ridge. Rusty, hanging beside him, let out a low whimper. Frank glanced upward. The rope had caught in a narrow groove of the rock wall above, pinched between two jagged protrusions. It wasn't dangerous, yet, but if they moved wrong, the tension could damage the rope or worse, snap a strand. He muttered under his breath, Of course you'd pick tonight." He shifted weight to his left foot and extended his body upward as much as the harness would allow. Rusty, sensing his strain, began to pant loudly, his paws scrabbling against the wall. One of his back legs twisted in the sling, and the dog yelped sharply, a guttural sound of panic that pierced Frank's ears and gut alike. No, Rusty, stay still," Frank hissed, trying to steady him. But the dog was struggling now, twisting, fighting the fear that had lived in his bones since he'd been trapped. Frank clenched his jaw. Damn it! He had no choice. He reattached a secondary carabiner to an anchor point in the rock face beside him, then began climbing back up toward the pinch. The muscles in his arms screamed immediately. He hadn't done this kind of reverse movement in 20 years, and every inch cost him, but Rusty's whines didn't stop. So he climbed. The light on his headlamp flickered once, then steadied, and he reached the pinch point. He used his gloved fingers to wedge apart the sharp edge of the groove, inch by inch, until the rope sprang free with a small jolt. He held his breath. The tension eased. He climbed back down to Rusty, whose body had gone limp again, but whose eyes tracked Frank closely. "I know," Frank muttered as he checked the dog's harness. "That wasn't fun for either of us." The two of them resumed their slow, nerve-wracking descent. The canyon was narrower here, the wind funneled and relentless. With each foot gained downward, Frank felt the canyon grow more claustrophobic, as if it were closing in. Then, when they were maybe 30 feet from the base, Rusty stirred. Not just stirred, he pulled. The dog shifted his weight, twisting his head toward a dark split in the rock, to the right of their planned descent route. His nose flared. He whimpered again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was urgency. "What is it?" Frank asked, eyes narrowing. "What do you smell?" Rusty barked once, sharp, intentional, and began to pull toward a ledge that branched off from their original line. Frank cursed again. "You want me to follow you now?" Rusty barked again. Against his better judgment, Frank swung their rope line toward the side path. He spotted a low, broken trail that hugged the canyon wall like a precarious shelf. With effort, he lowered them onto it, unclipping the harness carefully. Rusty hit the ground first and took off immediately, following his nose, tail low but wagging. Frank, panting hard, had no choice but to follow. They walked for about 50 yards along the uneven trail until the canyon opened slightly into a shallow alcove. That's where Frank saw it, a backpack. It was wedged between two fallen boulders, partly torn open. A cheap aluminum water bottle lay nearby, dented and dry. The pack itself was dusty, but the color was still visible, a forest green with faded black straps. Frank approached cautiously. "Anyone out here?" he called. His voice bounced off the rocks, then faded into silence. He crouched beside the pack and unzipped it slowly. Inside were a half-used roll of bandages, an empty snack wrapper, and a cracked phone. Its screen shattered, battery long dead. Rusty sniffed at the items, then barked again, low, almost mournful. Then Frank saw it. A trail. Not footprints, but small dark drops along the rock. Blood. His breath caught. Rusty had already begun following the trail. His gait was faster now, ears perked, nose to the ground. Frank chased after him. After another turn through the narrow passage, Frank saw something that stopped him cold. A man. He was collapsed near the base of a sheer wall, half concealed by brush and stone, maybe 35, Caucasian, medium build, with a short beard and dark hair. He was dressed in hiking gear, dirtied and torn, and his left leg was twisted at a sharp angle beneath him. A dried streak of blood ran down the side of his face. Frank knelt beside him. His hands were shaking. He touched the man's neck. A faint pulse. Shallow breathing. Alive. Barely. Rusty moved beside the man and whined, then began licking his hand. Frank blinked. "He's yours, huh?" The dog looked up, then returned to licking the man's fingers. Frank took off his jacket and laid it over the man's chest. He didn't know who this was, didn't know what had happened. But he knew enough. Rusty hadn't just been trapped. He had stayed behind, refused to leave. The pain behind Frank's temples returned. Not physical now, but memory. Evan, his son, 17. The night he left. Frank had come home drunk again. The fight was loud, bitter, full of words they could never take back. Frank had accused Evan of being weak. Evan had screamed, "You only see your failures, Dad, but I'm not yours to fix." Then he had walked out the door. Frank had never heard from him since. Now, in this canyon, beside this unconscious stranger, Frank felt that same pit in his chest, the ache of being too late. But this time, maybe he wasn't. Rusty moved closer to him, resting his chin on Frank's knee. Frank's hand reached down without thinking and brushed against the dog's neck. For the first time in years, his touch wasn't met with fear or rejection. Just warmth, just trust. The canyon air was thinner here, heavy with stone and silence. Frank Delaney sat back on his heels, sweat cooling against his spine, as he looked down at the man collapsed between the rocks. The man's chest rose faintly beneath Frank's old flannel jacket, and his lips were cracked with dehydration. But he was alive. Beside him, Rusty, calm now, but alert, remained pressed close to the man's body like a living blanket, refusing to move more than a few inches. Frank reached into his pack, retrieved a half-filled bottle of water, and dribbled a bit onto a bandana before lightly dabbing it against the man's lips. The man's throat moved slowly. Barely. But it moved. Encouraged, Frank tried again, this time letting a few drops trickle into his mouth. The man's jaw twitched, and after a pause, his eyelids began to flutter. "Come on, stay with me," Frank muttered, checking for the pulse again, still weak but steady. "You've held on this long." The man groaned softly and turned his head slightly. When his eyes opened, their dull blue color flicked to Rusty first. His cracked lips shaped a word that came out as breath. "Rusty?" Frank leaned forward. "Yeah, he's right here. You're safe." The man's eyes drifted toward Frank, trying to focus. "Who are you?" "Name's Frank. I found your dog stuck on a ledge. Looks like he was looking for someone. Now I know who." The man gave a weak nod, then winced at the movement. "Legs busted," he rasped. "I figured," Frank said. "You're wedged between two boulders and your foot's pointing in the wrong direction. Don't try to move." The man's jaw clenched. "I fell trying to get down. Rope snapped. He paused, coughed, and winced again. "Easy. Save your strength." Frank reached for the radio, clipped to his pack, and toggled it on. A burst of static met his ears. He adjusted the dial manually, setting it to the emergency frequency he had used on construction jobs in the past. After a few tries, a clear voice cut through the noise. "This is Zion Emergency Dispatch. State your call sign." "This is Frank Delaney," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that still hummed in his veins. "I'm about 200 feet below the eastern ridge of Whispering Stones Canyon. I've found an adult male hiker, unconscious when discovered, now responsive. Left leg likely fractured. Signs of dehydration and possible concussion. I need a rescue team out here." The voice on the other end was professional, calm. "Copy that, Mr. Delaney. Can you confirm any identifiers?" Frank looked down at the man. "What's your name?" "Ethan Brooks," the man whispered. "Name's Ethan Brooks," Frank repeated. There was a pause. "We have a missing persons report matching that name. A guide from Red Cliff's Outdoor Tours, missing since Wednesday." "That fits," Frank said. "We're dispatching a rescue team. Terrain is unstable. ETA approximately 90 minutes. Do not attempt to relocate the subject." Frank sighed. "Understood. I'll keep him stable." "Keep radio open. We'll ping this transmission for GPS lock. Dispatch out." He clipped the radio back and turned to Ethan. "Help's on the way. Don't go passing out on me again." Ethan gave a faint, pained chuckle. "No promises." Frank crouched beside him again. "You said you were a guide?" Ethan nodded weakly. "Yeah, took a group on the upper trails. We broke camp early, planned to loop past the switchbacks before the heat hit. Saw something move off trail. 2 pups. Thought they were coyotes at first, but they were limping, barely standing." Frank's brow furrowed. "Dogs? Like Rusty?" "German Shepherd mixes, I think. Maybe a few weeks old. Someone dumped them, I guess. I didn't want to leave them. Told the group to keep moving. I'd catch up. Tried to get them down. That's when the rock slide happened. I stashed the pups on a ledge, higher up. Thought they'd be safer there than out in the open." Frank shook his head. "So Rusty, he followed me." "Always does," Ethan said, the words slurring slightly. "He's trained for trails, rescues. Smart. But the ledge gave out under him before I could clip his harness. He went down. I tried to follow, but I didn't tie in. Rope slipped." Frank looked at Rusty, who now rested his chin gently on Ethan's forearm. "You've got one hell of a dog." "He's family," Ethan murmured. "Saved people, found kids. Never thought I'd need saving." Frank didn't respond right away. He looked back toward the darkened ridge they descended. The sky above was cloudless, a wide stretch of stars spilling over the sandstone cliffs. His bones ached, his back throbbed, but inside, something lighter stirred. "He came back for you," Frank said finally. "After the fall, he climbed with me, didn't hesitate." Ethan smiled faintly. "He always does the right thing, even when I screw it up." Frank sat beside the man, one hand resting on the dog's back. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The cold settled around them, but there was a strange peace in it, the kind that follows after surviving something you shouldn't have. Eventually, Ethan spoke again, voice thin. Is it bad if I say I'm more worried about the puppies? Frank looked at him. You stashed them somewhere up high? Ledge above the switchback trail, small, safe from predators, or it was. He winced. They had no food. I left my pack near them, but I think I took too long. Frank gave a small nod. We'll find them, after the rescue team gets here. You sure? Ethan asked, eyes glassy now. I am, Frank said simply. You've done your part. Let someone else finish the job. Rusty let out a soft sound, somewhere between a sigh and a low bark. He nudged Frank's hand once, as if in agreement. The radio crackled again, and a voice confirmed, Rescue team en route. ETA now 72 minutes. Frank smiled grimly. Plenty of time to make introductions. The canyon walls glowed faintly under the early morning starlight, cold and ancient, as Frank Delaney sat beside Ethan's unconscious form, one hand resting on Rusty's back. The radio crackled with voices far away. Dispatch updates, wind warnings, the occasional metallic beep of positioning checks. But the only voice Frank truly listened to was the one in his own mind, quietly screaming at the ticking clock. Update from Air 2, a voice finally said through the speaker, clear but urgent. Evac delayed due to rock slide near trailhead. Terrain compromised. Estimated arrival now 2 hours. Repeat, 2 hours. Frank stared at the radio like it had just betrayed him. He clicked the receiver once to confirm he heard, then leaned back against the stone wall and closed his eyes. 2 hours. 2 hours might as well be 2 lifetimes. For dehydrated puppies left on a ledge, exposed to wind and whatever wild things called this canyon home. He looked down at Rusty, who had been watching Ethan without blinking. We can't wait, can we? He murmured. Rusty stood up slowly, tail low, posture tense. He took a few steps up the rocky incline, then turned to Frank, his amber eyes locking onto his as if to say, You already know what to do. Frank tightened the straps on his pack again. All right, he sighed. You lead, I follow. He left his jacket on Ethan and checked that the man was stable and breathing evenly. Then he picked up a nearby rock and scratched a quick message onto the flat face of the boulder beside him. Went for the pups, coming back. They retraced their path through the narrow canyon, then diverted along a steeper fork Rusty had sniffed at earlier. The trail rose sharply, and Frank could feel the toll of the night in his knees and back. Every incline stole another breath. Every scramble over loose shale echoed with memory. Scaffolding, broken beams, a fall that nearly took his life, and almost cost him his son. The air thinned as they climbed higher. Above them, the stars began to fade into a faint blue haze as dawn crept toward the rim of the world. Rusty stopped near a jagged split in the rock and barked once, sharp and certain. Frank caught up and looked where the dog pointed. There, a ledge jutted out from the canyon wall, not wide, not stable, but enough. 2 small shapes huddled near a makeshift windbreak of stones. Frank's chest tightened. He moved fast, too fast, and nearly slipped on loose gravel, but Rusty steadied him with a nudge. When he reached the ledge, he dropped to his knees. The puppies were smaller than he expected. Cream-colored fur, barely a month old. One was shivering violently, nose pressed against the other's shoulder. The second pup wasn't moving. Frank's hands went straight to the still one. He pressed 2 fingers to its neck. There was a pulse, weak, barely there, but present. All right, little guy, you're not done yet, Frank whispered. Then the ground gave a warning groan. Frank froze. The ledge beneath them, already narrow, had begun to shift. A crack opened in the rock, small but fast. Rusty barked wildly and backed up. One puppy, the shivering one, scrambled into Frank's lap. The other, limp in his hands, began to slide as the edge beneath it crumbled. No, 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 no! Frank lunged. His hands caught the fur, but the rock tore out from the cliffside with a roar, and the puppy slipped from his grip, down into the blackness. Frank screamed, a sound primal, broken, torn from the depths of memory and failure. He held the surviving pup, light, trembling, and breath fast as a hummingbird, and crawled backward from the collapsing edge. The wind picked up dust, cutting into his eyes. Rusty stood by him, still and silent, tail pressed to the rock. Frank didn't move for a long time. He knelt there with the puppy clutched to his chest, shaking, blinking through the tears that refused to stop. And then, For the first time in decades, he let go. He cried. Not a few quiet tears, but deep, hoarse sobs that shook his chest and echoed off the stone walls. Tears for the puppy he couldn't save, for Marley, for Beth, for Evan, for every time he hadn't been fast enough, good enough, there enough. Rusty didn't move. He just sat beside him, eyes forward, ears alert, like a soldier standing silent watch during grief. Frank pressed his face into the pup's fur and whispered, "I didn't get there in time. I was too late." The wind whispered through the canyon again, but this time it didn't mock. It simply moved. After several minutes, Frank wiped his face on his sleeve and looked down at the puppy in his arms. The pup had stopped shaking and was looking up at him with tired, blinking eyes. Frank touched its ear gently. "Milo," he said, "that's your name." Rusty gave a soft sound, approval. Frank stood slowly, his legs stiff and his back sore. He adjusted his sling and cradled Milo close to his chest. Then he looked back at the broken ledge where the other had fallen and whispered, "You mattered too." He turned to Rusty. "Let's go home." The morning sun had barely crested the jagged spine of Zion's eastern cliffs when Frank Delaney stumbled back into the clearing where Ethan lay, still bundled in Frank's jacket, his face pale and drawn. Rusty walked at Frank's side, ears perked, body tense, while Milo, small, weak but alive, was cradled against Frank's chest in a makeshift sling made from an old t-shirt. Frank's limbs ached with every step, but his grip on the puppy never loosened. The ledge's collapse still rang in his ears like a phantom roar. He hadn't stopped replaying it since. Ethan stirred as they approached, eyes squinting open, dazed, but clearer than before. "You found them?" Frank crouched beside him and gently lowered Milo onto Ethan's chest. The puppy gave a soft yelp and nuzzled close, tiny paws clutching the man's sleeve. Ethan blinked rapidly, his voice thick. "Both?" Frank hesitated, then shook his head. "Just one." Ethan closed his eyes for a long moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. The radio at Frank's hip crackled to life. "Base to Delaney, helicopter visual confirmed, ETA 3 minutes, preparing to lower field medic, stand by." Frank sighed. Relief warred with the tension in his gut. They were almost out. But the canyon had other plans. A low groan vibrated beneath their feet, a sound that had nothing to do with wind or engines. Frank's eyes snapped upward to the cliffs surrounding them, and that's when he heard it. A deep, ancient growl, as if the mountain itself had taken a breath. Then everything began to move. Boulders the size of refrigerators cracked free from the upper rim. A rumble thundered across the canyon, like a freight train rolling over gravel. The slope above them exploded into chaos, rock, shale, and dust cascading down the walls like a broken dam. "Move!" Frank shouted, lunging forward to pull Ethan by the arm. Rusty barked once and took the lead, weaving through the trees that lined the canyon floor. Frank grabbed the sling holding Milo and cradled it tightly as he half-dragged Ethan toward the cover of a nearby rock overhang. Dust swirled around them like a choking fog. The sound was deafening, ancient, and relentless. Chunks of stone smashed into the clearing, one tearing through the area they had just left. The radio at Frank's side sputtered, then died. For several minutes, the world became nothing but noise, grit, and breathless prayer. When the roar faded, all that remained was silence. Broken, stunned silence. Frank coughed violently, brushing dust from his face, and looked around. The entire exit path had vanished, swallowed by a fresh pile of rock and broken trees. The way out was gone. He turned to Rusty, whose face was streaked with dust but uninjured. The dog's ears twitched, and he was already scanning the cliffs, head cocked as if calculating. Ethan groaned. "Is it over?" Frank nodded. "The rescue path's buried. They won't be able to reach us from that side. So now what?" Frank looked at Rusty, who had turned away from them and begun walking up a steep incline of cracked stone. He barked once, stopped, looked back. "You've got to be kidding me," Frank muttered. Rusty barked again, more insistent this time. Ethan gave a breathless laugh. "Your dog's trying to lead us again." Frank stood slowly, his knees stiff, his heart still racing. "He hasn't failed us yet." With Ethan leaning against his shoulder and Milo nestled in the sling, Frank followed Rusty up the side slope. The dog moved with purpose, choosing each step carefully, avoiding unstable ground. The incline was brutal, and Ethan's broken legs slowed their progress to a crawl, but Rusty never moved too far ahead. He always paused, always looked back. They climbed for nearly 20 minutes through debris and loose gravel until Rusty suddenly veered left, disappearing into a narrow crevice between two slabs of stone. Frank followed cautiously, and what he found on the other side made him blink in surprise. It was a trail. Faint, crumbling, half erased by time, but unmistakably man-made. Old wooden markers leaned out of the rock face, one half buried under moss and dust. A collapsed rope railing curled like a fossil along the edge. The path led down the mountain, curving gently but steadily. "A forgotten trail," Frank whispered. "Rusty, how the hell did you find this?" The dog wagged his tail and nudged one of the markers, then looked expectantly toward Frank. Ethan was pale but conscious, sweat dripping down his temple. "Can you get us through?" Frank studied the path. Narrow, unstable, but walkable. "With help, yeah. It's risky, but better than waiting for a rescue crew that can't reach us." With effort, they began their descent, one step at a time. Frank fashioned a crude brace from branches and rope to keep Ethan upright. Rusty trotted ahead, occasionally stopping to bark if Frank veered off course. Milo whimpered now and then, but stayed curled close to Frank's chest, heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Meanwhile, in Springdale, Lana Cooper stood behind the counter of her cafe, the television on mute, her eyes locked on the scrolling headline at the bottom of the news screen. Zion Rockslide traps missing guide, search and rescue en route. A still photo showed the ridge area, part of the Whispering Stone system. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her phone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in months. Cliff Randall, her cousin, and part-time search and rescue volunteer with Zion's East team. "Cliff," she said without preamble, "is Frank Delaney involved?" A pause. "You heard already?" "Tell me." "I can't say much, but yeah, he's the one who found the missing guy. They're trapped now. We lost contact with his last position 15 minutes ago." Lana's throat tightened. She stared out the cafe window at the empty parking lot. "Cliff, if there's anything you can do to get a message to him, do it." "I'll try," he said. "I promise." She hung up and stared down at the counter. Her reflection in the stainless steel coffee machine looked older than she remembered. Lines of worry that hadn't been there the day before. She whispered, "You better not give up now, Frank." Back on the trail, Frank and Rusty finally reached a narrow ledge where the overgrown path widened slightly. Frank collapsed onto a boulder, gasping for air, cradling Milo gently as Ethan leaned against a tree, breathing shallow but steady. Rusty sat beside them, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he knew this wasn't over, but they were one step closer. The scent of antiseptic clung thick in the air as Frank Delaney sat in a stiff plastic chair in the corner of a small hospital room. His left hand was wrapped tightly in gauze from a rope burn, and a deep scrape across his cheek had been cleaned and left to sting in the cool air. A thin line of stitches ran across his forearm, where a rock had caught him during the last descent. But Frank barely noticed any of it. Rusty lay curled at his feet, head resting on Frank's boot, eyes closed, but his ears twitched with every noise from the hallway. He hadn't left Frank's side since the medevac had finally reached them the morning after the landslide. He had growled at a nurse when she tried to take Frank's coat. No one had tried again. Across the room, Ethan Brooks lay motionless under crisp white sheets, an IV in his arm, and oxygen tubes beneath his nose. His face was pale but calm, and his left leg sat elevated in a sling. The doctors had told Frank just hours earlier, if you hadn't reached him when you did, the infection in his leg would have become systemic, maybe within hours. He wouldn't have made it to morning. Frank hadn't known what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He'd simply nodded and turned back to the window, where the red peaks of Zion shimmered under the rising sun like sentinels watching over the wounded. Now, as the sun reached its zenith, a knock tapped gently at the door. Frank didn't answer. Rusty lifted his head. Then the door opened, and a familiar voice filled the space. "I brought soup. And before you complain, yes, it's the kind with the noodles you like." Lana Cooper stepped inside, carrying a small thermos wrapped in a towel. She was still in her cafe apron, a bit of flour on her sleeve, hair tied up in a messy bun, but her presence lit the sterile room with something softer than light. Frank looked up and shook his head faintly. "How the hell did you find me?" Lana smirked. "Small town, big news." She crossed the room, placed the thermos on the table beside him, and sat in the chair next to his. Her eyes flicked to Ethan. "He gonna make it?" Frank nodded. "Barely. Another couple hours," they said, and it would have been too late. Lana let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "You saved him." Frank didn't answer. The silence stretched until Rusty nudged Lana's hand gently. She smiled and scratched behind his ears. "And you too," she said softly. "You magnificent mutt." Frank looked at the soup for a moment, then finally spoke. "You know, out there, on that ledge." I heard her voice. Lana turned to him, her brow knitting slightly. "I've been hearing Beth in my head for years now. Thought it was just memory. Guilt maybe. But out there in that canyon, I realized something." He paused, eyes distant. "It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in my hands, in the way I clipped the harness, in the way I spoke to that dog, in the way I didn't give up." His voice grew quieter. "She's still with me, not just in memory, in motion." Lana swallowed hard, her voice low. "Maybe that's what love is, Frank. What doesn't leave." Frank gave a dry chuckle. "You sound like her. That's why you keep me around." They both fell silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt like the breath you take at the end of something long and hard, when the danger is over, but the weight hasn't quite let go. Just then, the door opened again, and a woman in a tailored blazer stepped in. Her hair was silver blonde, and she carried a microphone clipped to her shirt. Behind her, a cameraman adjusted focus. "Mr. Delaney," she asked politely, "I'm with Channel 5. Would you be willing to talk to us? We're doing a piece on your rescue. The story's everywhere. Social media's calling you, the old man who saved Zion." Frank blinked. "You're kidding." She smiled. "You carried an injured man down a mountain, rescued a puppy, and saved his dog. People want to hear from you." Frank looked at Lana, then at Rusty, who now sat tall, ears perked. He gave a tired grin. "You can talk to the dog." The woman laughed, but before she could speak again, a nurse appeared behind her and whispered something. The reporter frowned, then nodded politely. "We'll wait." "No pressure." She stepped out. Frank sighed and sat back. Lana leaned in. "You know they're not wrong." "About what?" "You saved 3 lives out there." Frank shrugged. "I was just trying not to fail one more time." Rusty nudged his hand. Frank looked down and patted the dog's head. "He was the brave one. Me? I just followed." Lana smiled. "Maybe for the first time in your life, you followed someone worth following." Frank looked back out the window. The cliffs of Zion stood firm and unyielding, same as ever. But something inside him had shifted. Not because of a headline, not because of the applause, but because out there, between rock and sky, he had finally answered the voice that had followed him for years. Not with words, but with action. The early afternoon light filtered through the half-closed blinds in the hospital room, casting soft bands of gold across the foot of the bed. The buzz of distant monitors and soft-heeled nurses echoed faintly through the hallway. Frank Delaney sat beside Ethan Brooks, arms crossed, one leg bouncing slightly in that old, restless rhythm he'd never been able to break. Ethan looked stronger today. His face had regained some color, and the swelling in his leg had started to go down. The IV still fed into his arm, and his ankle was wrapped in a surgical brace. But he could sit upright, and most importantly, he could speak clearly. Rusty lay in the corner, watching both men with a kind of focused serenity, ears forward, tail gently tapping the tile floor every so often. He hadn't moved more than 10 feet from Frank since the rescue. Ethan was the first to speak. "You ever think about what comes next?" Frank gave a dry chuckle. "At my age, next is usually a nap." Ethan grinned, but there was something behind the expression. Hesitation. Wait. "I mean for Rusty," Ethan said finally. Frank stopped moving. The room seemed to still with the words. Ethan leaned back against the pillow, taking a breath. "They're sending me back east. Home. My mom's place. I need surgery. Long rehab. Could be 6 months before I can walk without crutches." Frank nodded slowly. "Makes sense. There's no one out there who can take him. My sister's allergic. My mom's got 2 cats who already hate each other. And I don't want him stuck in some kennel. He's not a dog you can shelve until you're ready again." Frank didn't respond. Ethan turned his head toward him. "I want you to take him." Frank blinked. "You what?" "I've seen the way he follows you. The way he listens. Rusty's never latched on to someone like that. Not even me. Ethan's voice was calm, but his eyes were rimmed with something like grief. You brought him home, Frank. You saved him. And he chose you. Frank stood up, walking a slow line between the hospital window and the bed. I'm not exactly retirement home material for a dog. I'm 60. I live alone. I haven't taken care of anything but myself since Beth died. Ethan tilted his head. But you did take care of something. Out there, you didn't just survive. You led. Rusty knows it. You know it. Frank stopped near the edge of the window, where the sunlight touched the frame. I'm not the right kind of man for a second chance, he muttered. Ethan's voice grew softer. Sometimes the second chance doesn't care if you think you deserve it. That evening, Frank didn't answer. He simply gathered his things, mumbled something about checking on Rusty, and left the hospital room quietly. The spare bedroom at Frank's house still held stacks of unused blankets and old hiking gear, untouched for years. It was a room Beth had once painted a pale yellow, believing, against reason, they might one day have grandchildren. Frank hadn't gone in there since the funeral. That night, Rusty padded inside without hesitation and lay down beside the empty twin bed. Frank stood at the door, watching the dog make a soft circle before curling in tight. Rusty didn't bark, didn't beg. He just stared back, calmly, like he already understood. Frank went to bed with a mind too loud to sleep. Hours passed. Midnight rolled into 2, then 3. Around 3:47 a.m., he rose from the couch and walked into the spare room again. Rusty lifted his head and watched him, alert but still. Frank crouched beside him, his knees cracking in protest. I told myself I wouldn't take on more, he whispered. Told myself it was too late. Rusty leaned forward and rested his head against Frank's knee. Frank's hand moved on its own, gently stroking the dog's soft golden fur. There are things we say and things we feel, he murmured. But then there are things that don't need saying, because they live here. He touched his chest. Rusty thumped his tail once. Frank leaned his forehead gently against the dog's. All right, he whispered. All right. The next morning, Lana knocked on his door with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a smirk on her face. She wore jeans dusted with flour and a sweatshirt that read, Zion Hikes, Est, 1979. Rusty greeted her at the door with a soft bark and tail wag. Let me guess, she said, stepping inside. You didn't sleep. I slept fine, Frank lied. She handed him the coffee and tapped the back of his arm with her fingers. Well, you better wake up fast, old man. I brought news. Frank raised a brow. Do I want to hear it? Lana's grin widened. The Parks Department called the cafe this morning. Apparently someone passed along your name to a ranger coordinator. They're looking for part-time guides, just for light hiking routes. Mostly retirees, tourists, senior groups. Frank stared at her. She shrugged. They said they're looking for someone with patience, life experience, and the ability to follow a trail dog in an emergency. Sound familiar? He laughed, and it surprised them both. Did you sign me up? I might have nudged a little, she said, her smile softening. It's not full-time, just a few weekends, but it's something. People trusting you again. Frank looked down at Rusty, who was now sitting neatly at his side. Well, he muttered, I guess I'd better find my boots. The morning sun crept gently over the ridges of Zion, softening the sharp angles of stone with golden warmth. In the stillness, the first footsteps of the day echoed on a narrow dirt path where few tourists ever wandered. Birds sang overhead. The canyon walls caught the sound and held it, and a gentle breeze stirred dust and pine. Frank Delaney moved at a steady pace, his boots worn, but his stride sure. He walked with a slight limp, an old injury never treated right, but it didn't slow him down. Beside him trotted Rusty, tongue out, tail waving, ears swiveling like twin antennas. The golden retriever had taken to his new life as if he'd been born for it. And in a way, maybe he had. Behind them followed a group of 8, mostly retirees, a few in their 60s, one couple well into their 70s. They wore bright sun hats and carried walking sticks, their laughter light, their questions frequent. And that, Frank said, pointing toward a half-shaded ridge above, is where the trail used to break off before the floods in '09. We call it the Faith Ledge now. Why's that? Asked a gray-haired woman in a green vest. Her name was Ruth. She was visiting from Michigan and had never hiked outside of the Great Lakes region before. Frank gave a quiet smile, because someone once trusted a dog enough to follow him there, and it saved his life. A murmur rippled through the group. "You mean that dog?" another man asked, nodding toward Rusty, who had stopped ahead to sit at the trail's curve, panting contentedly. Frank chuckled. "That very one." The group approached the overlook. From this height, they could see a sweeping panorama of the Eastern Canyon, the stone glowing 1,000 shades of red and gold. Frank took off his hat and squinted into the horizon. There was a silence, reverent and still. He didn't tell them everything. Not about the lost puppy, not about the voice in his head, not about the man whose life hung on hours and a tether line. But he always told the part that mattered. That sometimes, when all seemed lost, the best direction came from someone who didn't speak. As the group rested and took photos, Rusty came to sit beside him. Frank leaned down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You're the real guide here," he muttered. "I'm just following paw prints." Later that day, the group descended toward the trailhead, laughter rising again. At the edge of the visitor lot stood a small cafe with a wooden sign hand-carved and painted in sun-faded colors. Rusty Trail Cafe. The building was small, warm, with a green tin roof and wide front porch. The scent of fresh-baked pastries drifted out through the open screen door. Inside, Lana Cooper stood behind the counter, rolling up her sleeves and sliding a tray of wild huckleberry scones into the display case. Her apron read, "Flour, Faith, and Firewood," a joke she claimed Frank inspired. She looked up as the group filed in. "Coffee's hot, apple pie's warmer. Anyone hike with Frank gets a free first refill." Rusty trotted in ahead of them, earning a chorus of delighted greetings. One of the women knelt down, tears in her eyes. "He's the one in the story. The one on TV." On the wall beside the counter hung a framed photo. Frank, standing tall despite his age, arm wrapped around Rusty's shoulders. Behind them, the canyon stretched into eternity. At their feet, 3 sets of footprints: Ethan's, Frank's, and Rusty's. The third paw print, smaller, barely visible, belonged to Milo. The caption below simply read, "The Edge of Trust, April 18th, 2025. Lana stepped around the counter and handed Frank a mug of strong coffee. "They keep asking when you'll write a book." Frank snorted. "I can barely write my name without backspacing twice." She smiled and gave him a playful shove. "Then dictated. Rusty can be your editor." The cafe was busy now, filled with laughter, cameras, and hikers reliving their quiet miracle. Frank stood off to the side, watching it all unfold, heart full but quiet. Milo, now stronger and more playful, sat curled in a basket behind the counter, occasionally barking for attention. Tourists came and went, but Frank never strayed far. The canyon had given him a purpose again, not as a rescuer, not as a hero, but as someone who showed others how to listen to the silence and still keep walking. Each evening, he and Rusty would sit on the porch of the cafe, with the sunset bleeding across the cliffs. Sometimes Lana joined, sometimes she simply waved through the window. And when the day faded and the trail emptied, Frank would lean back, scratch Rusty's neck, and whisper, "This is what home feels like." In the moments when hope seemed to vanish, when all that remained was wind, stone, and silence, a man who thought he had nothing left discovered a reason to live again. Not through grand miracles, but through the steady gaze of a loyal dog, a bark echoing across the cliffs, and the quiet companionship of those who never gave up on him. Frank wasn't a hero. He was a reminder that God can work miracles even through those who feel broken. Through Rusty, the dog who never left his owner's side, through Milo, the tiny heartbeat saved from the edge, through Lana, the woman who believed in second chances, we see that grace doesn't always come with thunder or light. Sometimes it comes through the warmth of a paw on your knee, or a voice deep inside urging you not to quit. Perhaps God doesn't always appear the way we expect. Sometimes he sends a dog to soften a hardened heart, a storm to shake us awake, a stranger to remind us we're not alone. And sometimes he waits for us to take one trembling step, so he can guide the rest. If you're feeling lost, if life has left you tired or uncertain, remember this story. Maybe the miracle you're waiting for is already happening. Maybe God is speaking through something small, something steady, something silent. Share this story if you believe in second chances. Comment if you've ever felt God lead you in your own way. Subscribe to this channel to follow more journeys that speak to the soul. May God bless everyone watching. And if this story touched your heart, type one simple word in the comments. Amen.